I'm Leah Scanlan, and I am a partner at Oak HCFT, where I lead our talent strategy and operation across both the firm and the portfolio. And as some of you may know, Oak is one of the premier venture growth equity firms with a dedicated focus in healthcare. And so that means for me, every day, I have the privilege of working with amazing entrepreneurs and executives. And so today, I'm especially excited because I have three truly transformational healthcare operators who have joined me to talk about the ever-changing and important role of the chief medical officer. So before we get into the meat of the discussion, I'd like to welcome Daniel, Caroline, and Ian. And just in advance, thank you guys so much for taking the time out of your busy days to be here. I know it's a lot, so I appreciate it. And would love to start quickly. Let's just do a quick round robin and go around and make some introductions. And if you can, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourselves and just tell us how you got to the CMO role. And Ian, maybe I'll start with you and we can just go counterclockwise from there.
So I'm an internist. I'm the chief clinical officer of Foresite Labs. Foresite Labs is a sister company to Foresite Capital Management, which is a multi-stage venture capital firm. As a chief clinical officer there, I'm mainly looking at companies that are really looking at bringing the bench side of discovery to the bedside and really doing that translational work that really needs to be done for transforming healthcare for the future.
My name is Carolyn Jasik. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Omada Health. We are a virtual care company that provides in-between visit care primarily for patients with cardiometabolic disease and really trying to solve the problem of what happens after the visit when someone gets diagnosed and gets a big treatment plan. How do we make that plan come alive at home and using technology for that?
I am Daniel Grossman. I am an emergency physician. I hold faculty appointments both at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and at Stanford University in California. I was most recently the chief medical officer at Best Buy, the large consumer electronics retailer with a healthcare division.
Would love to hear from you guys on, like, how do you think about the role of CMO, maybe pre and post COVID, or do you think the role has changed at all and shifted?
Yeah, certainly my role as being a chief medical officer at a retailer was unique in COVID, as you can imagine. My job description, so to speak, coming into the organization was really focused on helping to build the strategy and execute corporate development for the healthcare business. So where's Best Buy going to play in health or healthcare delivery or healthcare enablement? As the pandemic came, the role shifted from help us build our strategy to how do we think about Best Buy's response both internally and externally to COVID? How do we think about our 125,000 employees in different environments in a retail store, in a supply chain, our third-party logistics, our folks abroad? How do we inform our employees about the threat? How do they encourage mask wearing or vaccines? How do we do that in different cultural contexts? Should our stores stay open or closed? How do we keep our customers safe? I didn't expect to do any of those things. And suddenly I'm in meetings about air filtration systems or working with other large corporations trying to roll out nationwide vaccine testing, or gosh, what do we do with a parking lot? Should we put that to use for pandemic purposes? And none of that is what I started doing. All of that takes clinical expertise and helps translate it into different languages for different populations, learning as I go. And that's the evolution of the role. I still think it comes back to translation. How does someone with a clinical background put on different lenses, use a kaleidoscope, whatever you want to call it, to talk to different audiences about different things at various levels of depth?
Yeah, no, for sure. Even though you're built in your service and your infrastructure and technology can support a virtual clinic or a virtual urgent care and even some automated triage and patient stratification, or sort of disease severity stratification. And we did all of those things early on. And those were like very quick changes that we put in place to help direct patients to the right level of care, help avoid unnecessary ER visits, and then also just triage our own service and see, who should get through to a visit right away versus who can afford to wait with some sort of pre-prepared direction and advice. But a really big question just after the original shock in the first 2 months of COVID was, Now, eventually we were going to have testing, and maybe even going to have treatments, and sort of who was going to be the first to get tested or have that capability, potentially was going to have, again, was literally going, their business was going to grow and scale exponentially during that time. So do you retool your business? Do you reset your strategy and your values to do, to solve that problem and to respond and become really a COVID response solution versus sticking to your core values and continuing on that path. And so I would say I lean more towards the latter, which was, we should be built for, like, we should be able to do our part because we have built enough infrastructure to be able to handle a portion of this. And we grew, at some point, like, I think it was like 150 to 200% of our daily volume. And so we certainly were able to show that we could scale that service quickly, but we didn't have to stay there for a very long time. And so, to be fair, we had enough analytics to say, well, maybe that's not going to be forever. And so we shouldn't just chase the COVID shiny object and in the moment, but do our best to address this with the tools and the workforce that we have, and then through new partnerships that are just going to help streamline the care and make sure that we're able to do the right thing at with a high level of quality. But so those were I think that was like just really one big challenge or decision that we had to make.
Carolyn, you had been with Omada for a number of years prior to COVID. Did you feel like the work that you were doing leading up to that point, and then the work that you were sort of tasked with in the midst of COVID or post-COVID, shifted quite a bit?
You are often asked to wear a hat because you're the only one in the room that the hat fits on, right? But it's really up to your professionalism and knowing your own limits to say, hey, this is where I draw the line. I'm out of my comfort zone here. I'm not an expert. And I think that we need to hire one. We need to ask someone. And I think that that's the sign of a really good startup hire in the digital health arena, is a clinician who is willing to flex and maybe be a little bit flexible, but they know when they're overstepping and when that overstepping could impact the business in a bad way.
I will say, I think it actually led to a lot more camaraderie around people in similar positions at different companies. Like my Rolodex, so to speak, of people I could call at various companies to say, like, hey, how does mRNA work? And can you come talk to my executives about something I don't know anything about?
Yeah.
Like that, the ability to find people who are in similar boats and learn from each other, I think that grew a lot more. And coming out of pandemic, I think executives, startup folks, they're looking for probably folks with more breadth of understanding than pure depth. So can you navigate bumpy roads? Can you pick up the phone and call someone somewhere else and help us all get informed as quickly as possible, Carolyn, to your point?
Right. That's a great point. I mean, it sort of plays into a little bit of sort of my next question, which was going to be around just like the CMO interface, pre or post COVID aside, but like the CMO interface with the broader executive team, whether it be CEO, COO, CFO in particular, like your, the community that happens within an organization, the people that you work with, like, do you interface? I mean, what is that connection look like for you? And again, like, regardless of COVID, just as a CMO in a business that's growing, quickly in sort of the healthcare, arena, what do you see in terms of your daily interactions with I mean, you sort of talked about a little bit in some of the stuff that you were doing and being tasked with, but what does that relationship look like for most of you? Is there like a most important person you need to make sure you're in lockstep with all the time?
I mean, I think the first is obviously your boss, the CEO. You obviously want to be lockstep with them. That goes without saying. And I think as a chief medical officer hire, as you're thinking about a company to join, you want to look for that CEO that values healthcare, that values your expertise, that trusts you, that understands what it means to put patients first, sometimes ahead of what might be best for the business, sometimes not. You have to make those choices. So I think finding a CEO that shares those values are really the first one. I will say I'm lucky in that way. I will say that. But in terms of my other closest relationship, for me personally and how my role has developed, it's our chief product officer. So really feeling that the chief product officer and I meet frequently. We currently have a standing slot. We call it the carpool slot, where we're both driving carpool on Fridays, where we talk every single Friday morning and we don't have an agenda. And I think those types of connections are really important with that key other partner. So I don't know what the other two feel like, but our chief product officer is the big one for me.
Yeah, and I think those make sense. And then I would just say maybe it depends a little bit on the definition for what your specific company needs out of the role as well. If I kind of said, well, what are the main buckets, and you all should add on to this, but like I think there's a quality role that a chief medical officer can oversee. There's an operations function that they can oversee. And then there's probably a sales function that they also may have a lot of, and then there's probably, you can either put everything else underneath one of those, or you can add on like thought leadership and strategic, it's probably strategy. Like that's another, maybe that probably is a fourth column for, so for all the work that can kind of come in underneath that. And so I think, so I spend a lot of time also with, with the next layer. I would say like you're definitely in the C-suite, and that's the question you asked about, but I would say I also found myself in the in-between layer of like, but the people who are going to actually make the trains run and gate patients seen are people in the like operations team that are like your chief operations person or your VP of operations that's helping run the delivery and efficiency of those systems and the quality of service. I think that's all important. And then also I spent a lot of time honestly with the other operations problem, which is the sales side, which is like, well, you have to keep that, ultimately every company has to stay alive. And so I ended up spending a lot of time with those people as well. That's not to say those are more important than the people that Carolyn said. They're just people I would add on, that you end up spending quite a bit of time with.
Yeah, I'll bridge that. The question is how are you adaptable in these? So Ian laid out, appropriately 4 buckets. You may be asked to join a company because of your clinical expertise, and you may marry quickly with the product person, as Carolyn said, because you're at that stage of the company. My boss at Best Buy was the person I spent a lot of time with as a partner to figure out what strategic direction we wanted to go in. When COVID came, the person I spent an inordinate amount of time on the phone with at various hours was actually the person who ran operations for all of retail, all of supply, like everything rolled up to this person, and little nuanced questions. We had to find trust with each other, and the ability to adapt based on what the organization needs to who your partner is really important. These are all translational roles. Yeah. So are you translating something that's in fact clinical for someone with product? The other one not to overlook is actually the board. So if you're joining a tech company where there might be a tech founder, for example, again, these are all very specific to what the company is and the stage of the company. The board members may or may not have depth of knowledge in clinical things. And so can you help translate things for the board and help them see directions or around corners or stuff like that? I think a lot about that as a role as well.
Where does a clinical operations leader come in? And in your experience, does clinical operations roll up to you? Or are these really separate roles, like your mandate versus a chief clinical officer's? Or like, how do those two things interface? Because, and I know it depends a little bit on the company, and I've seen it vary, but curious your experience, because I think that this is one where sometimes it can throw companies off, and there's a misconception on like what the differences actually are.
No, it's actually, this is a really good question. And I've been asked this question and I struggled with the question, some people have said, well, what do you do out of the gate? And, and so I think it can evolve. So just based on the experience I had, at Doctor on Demand, we did not have a COO. So I sort of saw the chief medical officer role as having some, having oversight and major input on the operations, because the major product delivery that we were delivering were medical visits, if you think about it, right? So that's the product. And so there's a lot of QA and QI, but also quality of service. So wait times and so on. And so I think because we were focused there, and we were, and the culture of our business was more like a medical practice probably than a technology company, it made sense at least for the early on when you're setting everything up and getting it going and, and then starting to scale it, I think it made sense for that to report to the chief medical officer. But then after our merger, we did think about it a different way and said, well, this is the operations are getting large. There's a whole workforce that was, that made up a huge, I don't know, remember the percentage of it, but it might've been like 30% of the company at that point. And so you have a ton of people now. And so it just wasn't as, and they were a different level of training and a different type of workforce than I was probably used to, supervising the clinicians. And so it made sense at that point probably to break that up. But I think you could start with with a COO also, and or an operations lead that reports directly to the CEO. It might just depend on what your who are the other people at the table and what they're, what are their, what do they like to do? What gets them up in the morning? What do they want to, how dirty, how much do they want to roll up their sleeves, and how dirty are they ready for their hands to get? I think I tend to be someone who tries to go back and forth from like high strategic level to always I like to solve problems, and I like to be in there with the legal team like Carolyn, talking about policy and, just learning as much as you can and absorbing as much as you can. But that means you have to be willing to do some of the work. I also could see how it could have played out very differently. And it's a conversation that came up multiple times where maybe our operations lead should be in another part of the shop. But
Well, I think that's a
numerous
good
times
point.
I
I
would
think
say
it
we
probably
decided
depends a little bit on the stage of the company too, right? Like where you are as a business, the evolution, the stage, it
right.
probably depends on that factor as well as sort of what the
Yeah.
actual product is that you're delivering. But I
Yeah.
think it's a question a lot of companies do sort of have to think through and end up talking about, and then, try to figure out like where those two things live. I mean, Daniel, Carolyn, I'm sure you guys have experienced some similar, but maybe slightly different experiences with the role.
Yeah, I can offer our model, which you always like your model because you built it. But and our company is unique. We have both non-credentialed and credentialed staff. I think Ian hinted at this. So we have health coaches who are non-credentialed staff, and then we have credentialed staff, which could be anything from a licensed physical therapist to a credentialed diabetes educator. And the way that we have split it up is, again, this goes back to what I was saying before, is as a clinician, what are my skill sets, right? A startup at the end of the day is about what are your skill sets and what value are you going to add. So the value I add is I know a lot about safety. I know about quality. I know about metrics. As it turns out, I have training in data. Not all clinicians do, but I happen to have that training. I am very involved in the innovation piece of what we're doing. So that's where I should lean in. I am not good at figuring out who is on PTO this day and who's on PTO that day, and this one's got the flu and that one's license expired. That is not my skill set. And I think I'm not unusual in that among physicians. And so I need help with that. And so as we evolved as a company, it made sense for someone else to be in charge of those pieces because that's how their brain works and that's their skill set. However, when it comes to hiring and firing and holding someone accountable to their work, we've taken the point of view that a licensed and credentialed clinician should report to a clinical leader. And the reason for that is because ultimately, this goes back to the values of the organization. What matters is, are the members getting the most high quality care? And so when it comes to hiring and firing, performance evaluations, you should be evaluated based on your impact on the members, not on how, the efficiency piece is important, but really we want to put the members first. So we have a really interesting model. So my clinicians are accounted for on the operations side, but they report to me. But the capacity decisions, whether I get to hire anyone, that's actually not my call. I get a headcount quota from operations. They tell me how many people I can hire each year. And operations also handles all of the aspects of staffing, scheduling, and all of that. So what it also requires is a ton of trust and teamwork with the operations lead, which I'm really blessed to have. I have an amazing relationship with our head of operations. And she basically makes all the decisions around my budget, my capacity, everything else. But I get to decide, well, the people that report to me get to decide who we're going to hire and hold them accountable for the work that they're doing. And so I think it's a great model, but it does require a lot of trust and teamwork.
If you're building a clinical culture and trying to maintain a culture that is prioritizing patient quality and compliance? Like, how do you strike that balance?
I think one thing that's really important for the clinicians that enter into a startup company, let's say, are going to come in as a new chief medical officer. I think you have to you have to leave at the door, check at the door some of the things you already know or are certain you know about healthcare delivery.
Mhm.
And Dan or Carolyn might have heard me say this before, but you have to unlearn a certain amount about that. And I'll just give a very concrete example. Most of our doctors that we were hiring were like, well, how long is a visit? I need 45 minutes to see a new patient. That's a new, like a new patient visit takes 45 minutes, no question about it. And then a follow-up takes 20 minutes, no question about it. I can tell you that we saw that was, first of all, not the case. We saw that the platform allowed for the time to be spent a different way. And so all of us had to relearn, the work that needed to be done and really start to question why, what are all the things around the culture that builds up in a typical brick and mortar practice, is it going to be the same in here? And so the answer was not necessarily, it didn't have to be. So we had to be willing to build a new culture and a new way to do the work. And that's why, luckily, that's why most of us were there, because there was already a great deal of dissatisfaction with what already existed. So then you get this, an opportunity to start with a new playing field, and then you can start to build a new culture, and then that you can find, there's probably a number of different ways to do that, but we establish core values. And I'll just give this one example where, putting the patient first was a very obvious one. And that was one that everyone in the company, would have been unanimous about. One that wasn't expected was we also had celebrate the art of medicine. And that was sort of a nod to the clinician in the equation and acknowledging that it's two people. Anytime you have an encounter, and we were really, as I said, we were in the business of medical visits. So we wanted to make those as the best that they could be. Then we needed to take care of both people in that encounter or in that visit. And that's something, when you're doing that correctly, it's called relationship-centered care. And that is something that I thought was really unique, and I think we should be, health systems should be trying to build more of that. But that was I think very core to the longevity of the product and the performance and the quality, but also, the culture of what we built together.
Just like Ian, we could talk all day about the balance of quality and growth. I think it's fun, actually, because as I mentioned, I'm in this for impact. I think all of us are. Like, all of us went into this field because we want to be part of some concept of a legacy of large impact, right? And so the quality piece is just so important. But when I first took over as chief medical officer, Omada was at a phase where it was time for us to up our game in order to access some things that were going to really unlock future business. We wanted to apply for NCQA accreditation. We wanted to acquire recognition as a deliverer of diabetes education. And these are very structured applications that require a lot of documentation and a lot of processes that Omada didn't have at the time. And we had the work, but we didn't have the documentation and we didn't have the structure to talk about it. And so it can be hard culturally to make that shift internally as an organization. So I still remember we called a meeting, and my partner in crime at that time, we made a document. It was called the Big Bundle of Bureaucracy, and that it was called the BBB. And the BBB still exists today. And what it was 7 tabs. It was, here's a list of all of our clinical protocols. Here's a list of our quality metrics. Here's a list of all of our quality dashboards. Here's our auditing process if somebody needs to come in and audit us. It was a culture shock for a lot of people at Omada because they had never seen that side of healthcare, right? They had never seen that. And in some ways, we were running away from it, right? We were running away from that side of healthcare. And we were all trying to say, no, that's what's bad. That's what's slowing down healthcare. But the reality is it has to be a balance. As you mentioned, Leah, you have to embrace some of those parts of healthcare in order to move forward. And so I think the biggest part of the balancing act that I saw at Omada was being curious, being open, talking about these things, grabbing some parts of it, leaving other behind, and honestly having some humor about it. By naming it the BBB, it made it a lot more accessible to everybody at the organization, because we were calling it what it is. It is bureaucracy, but that doesn't mean it's trash, right? That means that there are some parts of it that are really great, but there are parts of it that honestly are quite bureaucratic.
Technology can help with some of that. Like, you can use technology to start measuring some of these pieces too. So a lot of the work that Carolyn's talking about, like for NCQA, that would have been done a certain way in a brick and mortar practice, you might do it very differently, in a tech enabled practice, right? Like, so So I thought those were some of the coolest moments for me, was that, like, that we are that bureaucracy didn't always have to be as painful, and it was really cool to figure out ways to, like, use the technology to measure certain things that, you would have hired people for. Now you're using technology, and doing the same thing, and so anyway, so it was really cool to just see those opportunities pop up where you didn't expect them.
Right.
And so even something as mundane as, like, how do you sort people to the right clinician in the right state is like, but when you do that in tech enabled way, it's a big reward, on multiple levels.
I'm going to switch topics quickly here, but it's, I think, one of the more fun ones to talk about. And I know we've all sort of sidebarred on this at one point or another. So will be fun to hear us all sort of talk about it as a group. But, there is a clear imbalance right now in terms of just the clinical talent that is available and the dearth that the market is seeing. We see it across our portfolio. It's probably one of the things that affects companies the most right now that are in healthcare, tech, digital healthcare, telehealth, any of these areas. I think are impacted by this. But I'm excited to get your thoughts on, what are some of the things you all have done as you've built teams, trained younger, sort of up and coming clinical talent, words of wisdom on how you think about, developing that next wave of clinicians. I think most organizations look to their CMOs more and more to help figure this out and think of creative ways to iterate this process. And, companies are relying more on nurse leaders for clinical oversight. Is there a right infrastructure in how you do that? I mean, would love to hear some of your ideas and thoughts, because this is, I think, something that's going to continue to plague healthcare companies for a long time. But there have to be some sort of solutions. And, you guys have been doing this for a while, so hopefully you have some to offer.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, I left academia, but I'm still at my core an academic. And part of being at academia is you're preparing people to leave, right? You're training people to go out and do amazing things. And your best outcome is if someone does something more amazing than anything you could have imagined for yourself. That is what an academic, that's the win for an academic. So I think I brought that mindset, or I'd like to think I brought that mindset to Omada. I think the first thing that I look for in an individual who comes to me, which happens all the time, and says, I'm thinking about digital health, regardless of whether they are already in digital health or they're training, is what's their mindset and kind of what's their personality? Are they humble? Are they creative? Are they flexible? Are they low ego? Are they able to sort of adapt into this environment? And if they aren't, talk about those skills, talk about the mindset, because I think the mindset's the number one thing. And then I think what we've done specifically to build the workforce, because current training, I think I feel comfortable saying pretty much across the board for all types of clinicians, does not anticipate this type of career and does not prepare people. I think people look to master's degrees like in business, or they might look to an MPH to try to get a little bit of extra training. But there really isn't any playbook. So we have had to train most people that come in from the get-go. And the way that we've approached it, we've done some formal things. So we have a postdoc for clinical research, and that's been a really great success. And proud to say we have some former people in roles in various places in digital health. And then I think with our core staff, we just really invest in structured learning. So we actually have webinar series. We have a training schedule that people go through. We've had conversations with the cross-functional counterparts in product and engineering. What do the clinicians need to be successful at our organization? And on an interesting side, the clinicians have also developed training for the product people, because honestly, product people and engineers come from traditional technology and they've never worked in healthcare and they don't have a lot of these expertise. So there's been some nice synergy there. And I think I'll finish by saying, the bittersweet part is people do end up leaving. I mean, we have this internal joke that we're Omadaversity, meaning that, people come and look for our employees because we've been around for a while, we hire well, and I think we do, I'm proud to say we do a great job with our employees. And so they're very competitive in the market. And so we have to tolerate the fact that they move on and they go to even better things, even though we'd love to keep them. But the internal investment has really been in, we've really sat down and honestly have training that we do for people for the various areas of the business that they're in, to help them. Like we just wrapped up a Finance 101 series, which God help everybody, I did for 3 weeks with my team about like the core components of corporate finance, because there's people on my team that don't know what a balance sheet is, don't know how to read an income statement, and you can't be at a startup and not know how to do those things, especially if you want to be a leader in the organization. So
really quickly, if you had to come up with one or two pieces of feedback for companies, for other clinicians, for other medical leaders, what are the one or two things you'd say about how you empower your team?
We had one. I mean, I think we did something that I was really proud of. We had an annual conference where we would bring our employed clinicians together, and they really set the quality metrics. They decided what the quality measures should be, and we even eventually came up with a score. This was not, I don't want to take credit for this, was my medical director came up with a score who that was able to really utilize the values and performance that doctors cared about. But then also we combined that with sort of a citizenship type metric as well that was along the lines of more operations and quality of service. And then we blended those to come up with a score. And the scoring and the sort of intricacy, that's not the most important thing. What was important was that there was buy-in from the clinical group and the people making the decisions that were at the front line, who had worked within the care environment, that could say what those values should be and what they wanted to hold one another accountable to. And then they were very happy to be recognized when they performed well at the top of that. And so it was a major incentive for them to have a system like that. It was extremely important to them. And then they really self-regulate, honestly. And we had a peer review system in place that was really the foundation that grew out of. And I think all of those things were super important.
I love that. Carolyn, anything you'd add to that, or Dan?
I mean, 7 years, gosh, there's so many things I would change and many things I'm proud of. I would say 7 years in startup, there are dog years. It feels like 49 for sure. I think to answer this question specifically, I would say one thing that I realized very early on that I was not expecting is clinicians don't come to digital health to just provide care. Actually, they want to see the impact of what they're doing, and they want to feel like they're part of changing healthcare. So the biggest thing that I've done that I think has both been impactful and that I'm proud of is to amplify the work of the people on my team. So to make sure that leadership sees everybody has a project, nobody's just seeing patients, everybody's part of something that is making the experience better, making the company better, maybe making the employee experience better. And we do a really great job of amplifying people's work so that they can feel proud of what they're doing and feel like their contribution, yes, is amazing member care, but they can also see their stamp on moving healthcare into a different direction. And I underestimated how much people were hoping for that when they make this career change. And it's every level of employee that I have on my team, because they've all left traditional healthcare, right, to do that. And so, so I'm really proud of that. And we do it in lots of large and small ways.
That's such a great reminder that people are inherently impact oriented and often mission driven, and that's why they're in it. Whatever the environment is that they're working in it, their desire is to create impact. I'll add two things, and they're maybe a little adjacent. One is for companies that are hiring chief medical officers or clinical folks, the idea that you need a chief medical officer so that you can have someone with the same title in the room when you're selling, I think it discounts the longevity of the potential relationship there, particularly around growth together, holding hands as you embark on new things or develop new concepts and products. one of the wonderful things about clinicians who have been in the world or looked at business before is that they can often see around the corner. And like Ian talked about, a large flu pandemic, the ability to look ahead and see what might be coming or some options of what might be there is actually what you want that person for. And if they can speak to someone on the other side who you're selling to, great. That's a common language that they have. The other part is we are clearly all people who have strong opinions, and our strong opinions should be debated. And the fact that you have a chief medical officer is actually just creating maybe a central hub or organization of debate. So take an opinion, take something someone says, and actually challenge it. And where does that come from? Are there other ways to look at it? Because we have been trained to say something and stick with it. But the humility to actually say, like, actually, that's what I think, but like, I might be wrong, isn't a great thing to use your chief medical officers for.
I really appreciate this, guys. This is awesome. And I think there's got to be a part 2 at some point, because I think we could all use a founder's guide to building the clinical organization and how to bring that healthcare DNA into your business. And I think you guys would be the perfect author for it. So hopefully there's like a to be continued sign on this, because it's been a lot of fun to have you all here. But I also think a lot of really good information. And, I think there is no sort of like one way fits all, but I think there is definitely some sort of, playbook or guide that is probably needed. So that'll be the next call you guys get. But I appreciate the time today, and I know we took a lot of it. So it's been fun to have you all here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great group.